talk is OSINT in the Hermit Kingdom, learning more about the world's most secretive nation. A bit about myself, I've been working in security for over 8 years now. I used to work for an automation company, did app development, vulnerability management. I just started a new job. I didn't get all my forms filled out in time to say where I work to go through all that process, but work for a big security company. I live in Boston. I'm on the Discord as Super Ductos. So certainly any questions, always happy to answer them. And always have to have a presentation that starts with a cat picture. This is my cat, Frank, and normally how he looks at me every day when I'm working. So a little bit about OSINT, if you're not familiar with what it is or where it comes from. The idea is that it's data that's collected from any kind of publicly available sources. So the idea behind this talk was how much information can we find out about a given topic? Something like North Korea, where it's a little bit more secretive, maybe we don't know as much. So just trying to see what is actually available out there that we can find and use. So we want to look at any kind of publicly available sources today. And really, we are not looking at, this doesn't have anything to do with any kind of open source software. Really, we're just looking at various websites and collections of information that we can use to see what we can learn about our various topics and do some of our research here. There's plenty of paid services out there that'll gather all this data for you and give it some nice context and make your life a little easier and do things automatically. But really, the goal of today is we're going to look at really just what's free. This was all done from sitting on my couch. This was actually something I started a couple of years ago, and someone said, hey, this would probably make a cool talk. A lot of what I did, I have a website that I publish. I'll put a link at the end also if anyone's interested in looking at it. But I think I spent a grand total of about $25 in the last probably 4 years that I've been working on this. So some of the benefits of using open source intelligence, it is less risky. Really, we're just looking to see what we can find on the internet. We're not going out and actually scanning any of these targets or really interacting with them. We're just relying on what we can find online. We can look for things, printed media, videos, all sorts of fun things that we can use to start learning about what we want to research. Again, it is cost effective. I haven't spent a lot of money on this project at all. It is pretty easy to gather all this information. This was spent while on the couch watching hockey. Certainly I'm not a lawyer by any means, but some of the things we do avoid is some legal issues, again, where we're not actually going out and running a port scan against anything. Everything we're going to look at today is already things that can be found online pretty easily. Some of the challenges, and some of these are things that I've personally run into. There is a lot of data out there. Again, I've probably been working on this for about 4 years now, and I have a lot of data, a lot of things that I just haven't actually gotten around to looking at. Very good at collecting things, but not always good at actually going in and reviewing some of the data, which is, again, part of the challenges when you are doing some of this research. One of the things people always ask is, if you work for an automation company for so long, did you automate any of this? Truthfully, no. It's always something that I've been meaning to do, but just haven't gotten around to doing that. Reliability is always another concern because, again, we're relying on third-party sources all the time. It's not data that we've actually gathered. So we want to, as best we can, try to verify and validate this data when we are starting to gather this and start doing our research on our targets or topics. Before we really get into it, one of the questions that always comes up, why North Korea? I always like to joke, it's fun to tell my mom that I go to conferences and talk about North Korea. To be perfectly honest, though, about 10 years ago, there was this Vice Guide to North Korea I saw online. One of the things that was interesting was it wasn't really designed as a political thing. They just went on a tour that anyone can go on a tour of North Korea. And they kind of just showed people going about their day-to-day lives. And I thought that was an interesting look at things. And really, that's the goal of this today is not to look at anything APT focused, not to look at anything political, really just to see what can we learn about North Korea's internet infrastructure. There's some pretty interesting things that you can find out there, and maybe things that people don't know about. But this is really just more of a general look at some of the things that are in their IP space and see what we can learn about it. So we want to start off gathering some information. We want to start to discover what kind of assets are out there. There's a couple of different ways we can gather this data. We can gather this data purely passively, which is again where we're going out to these various websites and sources where we're collecting all this data from. Semi-passive, we'll talk a little bit about this also. This is where I'm not necessarily going out to any of these sites, but I can use things like URL scan or some other services that'll go out and check a website for me. Built with is another great example if you want to know all the web stack of a website to see what it was built with. Where again, we're not actually going out and doing any of these checks. We're still putting something between us when we're gathering this data. And then what we're going to try to avoid is doing any kind of active information gathering. We don't want to just start running Nmap scans here. We want to try to use the first two as much as possible. So what are we trying to identify? Today we're going to look at trying to discover just what's online for North Korea's IP space, any kind of services running on them. We can identify versions, any kind of cloud services, operating systems. We want to try to just build a map of this IP space and of our organization and see exactly what we can map out and discover. So we need to start off, we need to define a scope. Where are we looking? The internet's a pretty big place. Thankfully for us, there's a nice Wikipedia article that describes North Korea and the IP addresses assigned to them. They have 4 Class C networks, 1,024 IP addresses that are assigned to them. We can see down the bottom there also, there is another block, that 210.52 block. We're gonna ignore that for today. It's usually nothing too interesting there, and it's always a little bit of a debate of whether or not that's actually in use. So we're gonna ignore that for the time being. As far as I can tell, there's never been anything really interesting there anyway. We're just gonna focus on these 4 Class C networks for today. So that's all well and good. We've defined the scope, but what happens if there's not a Wikipedia article? Again, this is pretty easy information to find. Using apple.com as an example, we can use something like the dig command. We can get some IP addresses that it resolves to. And then we can do a whois lookup for some additional information. We get the AS number, or the autonomous system number, which is how we start to identify IP blocks that are assigned to organizations. In this case, I can see it's AS714. And I can go online, I can verify this information. I can see that Apple is assigned AS714. They have more than 49 million IP addresses, but I can easily verify this information. So I maybe don't want to always trust Wikipedia. Maybe I've edited the article to win a bet at the last minute. So I just want to do the same steps, and I can verify, yes, these 4 Class C networks, they are assigned to North Korea. So now we have a starting point for at least where we want to start looking. So now that we know where we can start looking, the next thing we want to do is we want to start to identify what's actually active in this device or in this IP space. So this was the earliest information I could find. This was from back in 2010. Someone ran an Nmap scan against North Korea. They found that there were 13 devices online at the time. This is a pretty cool website. It's really the only page on that website, but it's cited by a bunch of other publications. It was the earliest I could find. So at least now we have a starting point to see kind of where things were at, where things started, and we can start to see how things have grown from there. So now we want to identify what's online today, though, because 12 years ago now, 11 years ago, it doesn't really give us a lot of good information. We want to see what's active today. So one of my all-time favorite websites to search is GitHub. We'll talk about GitHub a lot today. There's a lot of fun things you can find on there when you start looking for it. But one of the easiest things we can find is people who are running scans against North Korea, and they are publishing their results on GitHub for us. So this makes it a lot easier. They also organize things in nice folders for us. So now I can start to see as things change over time. Makes it much easier if we can find things like this. And why do I love GitHub so much? You can find all sorts of fun things on there. People are committing things to GitHub that they probably shouldn't be. Again, we'll see later on where Some other things have been committed to GitHub that are pretty interesting to look at. North Korea has even committed to GitHub on a couple of public repos for software that they use, which we've found as well. So there's a lot of things on there that you can use when you really start looking into GitHub, and you can find a lot of good details in there. So we can use our GitHub results from all of our Nmap scans. We can also use other sites. I'm sure everyone is familiar with Shodan. The best $5 you can spend on Black Friday is for their membership. But we can get a good bit of information here about what's online, what's active. Same thing, Censys is another internet-wide scanning site. But now we have a couple of different sources here that we can use between these scan results that we can find online and some of these internet scanning services. We can start to build a map, and you can tell this is a map that I built, but we can start to see exactly what's active inside of these 1,024 IP addresses. And out of those 4 Class C networks, there's roughly about 30 to 33 devices online active at any given time. Sometimes a little more, a little less, but generally this is what's being used on average. So really quickly, we started with just an idea of what we wanted to look for. We narrowed down our scope. We identified what kind of devices are online. And now we want to start to learn a little bit more about what are these devices. We have about 33 devices, give or take, that we want to get some more information about. Really one of the only times we'll ever do any kind of active investigation is here when we will actually just put that IP address into our browser and pull it up and see what we get. So this is one that I put in, and we can see some information here. Apache web server running on port 80. But one of the interesting things is we can see Red Star 4.0 is the operating system. So if we take a little detour, if you're not familiar with the Red Star operating system, if we looked on that old scan results back from 2010, a lot of the operating systems were identified as Red Hat or CentOS. Red Star is essentially a fork of Red Hat, CentOS, and it's a state-sponsored operating system developed by North Korea. There's a couple of different versions of it available. There was some research in Germany done on it that really did some great work. We learned a couple of things about that. There's some binaries on there called SCN-PRC. It's a file scanner that runs in the background, and it uses various strings of text that it looks for. It gets entered in, it gets automatically deleted. OPPRC is another one. Essentially, it watermarks a file, so you can establish a chain of custody on who created it, who modified it. So as you're working on various files, you can see who made changes to it, and that all stacks up in the background for tracking essentially who's touched a file at any time when using the Red Star operating system. So I can send out a link to the slides as well if anyone's interested in this. Again, they did a great talk and really did a lot of research on the OS. They put out a lot of tools that you can use to disable a lot of these things that are running on there as well. And if you haven't seen what Red Star looks like, this was version 1. Had that nice Windows XP feel to it. Version 2, changed it up, a little more of the traditional Linux desktop experience. Version 3 was an interesting one. This was a pretty big change, especially interesting because around this time, there were pictures coming out of North Korea where we started to see Apple devices on desks, we started to see iPads being used. So naturally, had to update the operating system to match that look. Now we do know that version 4 is available. Versions 2 and 3 you can find online. They're on archive.org. They're really easy to download. Version 1, as far as I know, isn't online anywhere. Version 4, again, we do know exists. One, because we've seen it when we browse to that IP address. This was also a magazine called Foreign Trade of the DPRK. This gets published about once a quarter by North Korea. It's essentially a magazine where they show all the things that they are exporting or able to manufacture and export. You can find this on their various websites. There's some interesting things in there that they can export, but recently there was an article in there about Red Star that it had been upgraded to version 4.0. So we do have a little bit of information about it. We do know that it exists, but as far as I know, it hasn't really made its way online yet. So with version 3 of Red Star, there were actually 2 editions published. There's a traditional desktop version, and then there's a server version as well. So I've always seen a lot of work done on the desktop versions historically. The server edition, it is online as well. But it is a little bit different from the desktop versions. There isn't as much surveillance software on there, but there's a couple of other binaries on there. There's something called Beam, RSSmon, and SEO Tools, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yum is disabled. And one of the more interesting things that I ran into when I installed it was that you are the root user, but you are still lacking certain privileges as you start really working with the operating system. So one of the first things I tried getting into was SE Tools, because it sounded like something that you could use for managing SE Linux. I figured I'd start there, see what I could find. Popped up with a password you had to enter. But that's really tough. And then I started seeing that I was getting permission denied, even when I was the root user. And I learned that the Red Star Server Edition is using what's called the Bell-LaPadula model for enforcing access control. And if you are like me and you're not familiar with this, essentially the idea was it was kind of a DoD use case. But the idea is you have things like secret, top secret classifications as well on files. So even if you are the root user, if you don't have the right classification level on your account, there are certain things that you're not able to access unless you add in that additional classification to your account. So that was something that, I'll be honest, I wasn't too familiar with. There's not a ton of information online. I started trying to work with it a little bit. But I said, man, it'd be really easier if I could just find a manual that explains all this for me. One of my other favorite tricks is to you start Googling in other languages. This is Red Star in Russian. I found a Russian forum where people were posting movies from North Korea because Russian tourists will go there. They can go a little more easily. They were posting pictures. They were posting manuals and textbooks from North Korea. One of the things that I found was the manual for the Red Star operating system there. This made it much easier for me because as I started scrolling through, I found something that looked like something that I could use to start modifying my account's privileges. Found all the commands that I needed to run. Google Translate also works frighteningly well now, especially when you hold it up, it'll auto-translate for you. Found the steps I needed. Now I could have some additional controls around my account or remove those controls so I could have access to all the files. The other interesting thing that I found in these guides where there's a guide similar to the CIS benchmarks for hardening Red Star servers. There's about 3 guides that I found. They're all about 150 pages long. I haven't had too much of a chance to go through them yet, but there is a lot of information in there as far as how the operating system works, what's on there, and then just a lot of basic concepts, DNS, SMTP, how that works as well. But now that I do have access to all these files, I don't have these same restrictions on my accounts. Now we can really start to dig into this and see what's running on here. I mentioned there were 2 additional programs, Beam and RSSmon. I started digging through those files to see exactly what they were. Essentially what they are is just a nice graphical interface for managing your Red Star server. So I started digging through some of the files. They're all written in PHP. Some of the things that I like is they don't trust /dev/u random to really truly generate random IDs. So they generate it twice and then they do a check to make sure that it's actually reliable. I thought that was pretty interesting to see. They also add in a lot of code for blocking things. They don't use anything like fail to ban on the server. They wrote in a lot of code. If you do enough things wrong, You do absolutely get locked out pretty quickly. I can verify that. But what does this all look like? So now that I had some of these additional permissions, I was able to start up this Beam program. I was able to log in. And again, really just a nice web interface for managing your server. You can see where I can configure bind here. I have all of my options available. I can see all my services on the left-hand side that I can easily set up. I will say it was actually a pretty nice setup. Again, having to use Google Translate all the time makes it a little bit slower to work with. But it was a pretty easy way to get your server set up and configured. So we still have a lot more to look at. One of the other things I found, I did find a cross-site scripting vulnerability on there where you could get session information out. So this is when I was just posting it to a webhook site as an easy way to test that, where I could get the session details of other users. I mentioned I do have a website where I post all this. It started probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and really it was just a way to put notes online if anyone was interested. I posted this, and within about an hour, I got a message. I get about 1 comment a year, maybe less. So I'm always very suspicious when I do get them. Someone said, "Oh, I'm interested in this. I want more details." I said, "I don't really think so. Send me an email." And I get an email from one of the most suspicious email addresses I've ever seen. So never actually replied to it, but it was interesting to see some of the response to it. So now that we know a little bit about what these devices are, we know there's about 33 devices. We'll wrap up at the end also about what some of the other things are that are running on there. One of the other things we want to do is we want to start to enumerate any domains as well. In our case, most of the domains that North Korea has, they all point back to that IP space that they have on the internet. But we want to see, is there anything else that we can find? Maybe it's pointing to AWS account or something else outside of that. Now, back in 2013, we learned that there are 28 websites registered to North Korea. They have their own top-level domain, .kp. The reason we know this is someone found that their DNS servers were misconfigured. They were allowing zone transfers. Someone found that at just the right time, and we found out there's 28 websites using that top-level domain. So that was a really good starting point. But we want to keep an eye on this and see, are there any new websites that come online? So in the years since, there's been a couple of additional websites that have come online. There's now 32 websites pointing back to North Korea with this top-level domain of .kp. There's 34 different domains. A couple of the domains point to the same site. But really, we want to find all these domains. Again, we want to see if there's any kind of subdomains that we can find. We can use passive DNS data to discover these domains, whois data, but it really gives us a good way now where I can take some of this information and start to map it back as well, and see if there was anything that we missed early on when we were doing some of this asset discovery. This was also a screenshot from the North Korean airline, Air Koryo, which is their official state-sponsored airline. One of the, again, interesting things is we can see all their flights are on time. If you look on Flight Radar, that's usually not the case. They're usually running a little bit behind always and get delayed pretty frequently. But according to their website, they're always on time. Flight Radar also started showing within probably the last 2-3 days flights within North Korea as well, which aren't listed on the website. North Korea has been pretty shut down during COVID. So it's been interesting to see some of the flights running again, even if they are just inside the country. It looks like they are starting to start flying a little bit again. So how can we start to gather this information? Again, what happens if we don't have a nice Wikipedia article or a misconfiguration that gets posted online? We can use some of this whois information, get information about who owns a domain, and then we can do things like reverse DNS lookups based off of this. Again, looking at Apple, they own a ton of domains for all sorts of fun things. Passive DNS data is a great source as well. This is where sites are logging all these DNS requests and all the information associated with them. So we can start to build out pretty good picture of any kind of domains associated with an organization as well this way. Censys is another interesting one, or you can use a website like crt.sh. If you have any kind of certificates, you can actually search the fingerprint there and see if it's being reused across any sites. So we can find a little bit of information that way as well. North Korea has started using more certificates on their website, even though they're not valid. But again, it gives us another way where we can start to search and see, are they being reused anywhere across their infrastructure. So I've been working on this for, I don't know, about 2-3 years. Then about 1.5 years ago, a new website came online. It's called dprkportal.kp. North Korea actually just publishes a directory of all their websites now with their top level domain. I personally have always taken this as a little bit of an insult, but it also makes it a lot easier now when new sites do come online. You can check here. So now that we know a little bit about our domains, we have our targets, we want to start to find out what kind of services are running on these different devices. Again, we can turn to some of our internet scanning services. This one comes from, it's called Zoomeye, which is essentially the Chinese version of Shodan. Again, we can get some good information about what's running on these devices. We can get some basic banner information. May not want to be something that we rely on, but at least it gives us an idea of what's there. One of the things we can also start to see with this is as we do start to look at essential services like DNS and mail services, those are all still running on Red Hat. Any kind of web servers that are just serving up the sites, those seem to have all been migrated over to Red Star now. We can find all sorts of other things on there as well. VMware was exposed at one point. We've seen various Adobe media streaming services that were exposed. There's Cisco routers that are found as well. And again, some of this, if we don't necessarily trust this or we're a little suspicious, we want to try to, again, validate that data as much as possible. We can search this same IP across various sites. We can make sure that everything really does match up, that everyone's reporting the same thing. And really what it comes down to, this is really the list of everything that's running. A couple of web servers, some DNS and SMTP servers. Down the bottom, there is 20 services running on port 8080. We'll talk about that one in a minute. A couple of Linux servers. There's a couple of Windows servers that pop up here and there. Sometimes it's actually just a laptop that gets plugged in. We have our Cisco router that we can find as well. So this is really where now we can start to have a pretty good idea of what we've seen. We've found all these active devices. We have a good idea of what's running on them. We have a good idea of what all the domains are. I mentioned this port 8080. This one's been interesting to watch over about the last 1.5 years. It shows up on a lot of these scanning sites. We'll talk about that one in a minute, but why is it important to identify all these services? Again, we have some banner information. May not be the most reliable thing, but it still gives us some pretty good information about our targets and what we're looking at. And we want to make sure that we're finding these things about our own organization before someone else does. So most of what we've been doing so far has been pretty passive, gathering data. We'll talk a little bit about semi-passive as well. This was something interesting that I found that someone had published. They essentially use one of those mail testing sites where you can just check your mail server for any kind of misconfigurations. But they ran it against a North Korean mail server. They found it was actually set up as an open mail relay at the time. So in theory, you would have been able to email inside of the country with, I forget the domain it was on, but that was found an open mail relay on one of their mail servers. There are sites like Proxy Checker. So port 8080, if we're going to assume that's a proxy, this will go out and try to test that. All of them failed. Port 8080 just always seems to appear and then it'll disappear for a few weeks and then it'll show up again. Still not too sure what it is. And then we can use other pretty creative things as well. SEO Tools will give you all sorts of information about your website. One of the things that it'll find is broken links, though. And on one of the North Korean websites, we can see down the bottom here, we have a link to an internal IP address, 172.200. This is something that's actually pretty interesting. This isn't necessarily something that was broken. Might have been left in there by mistake, but it is something pretty interesting that it tells us about North Korea's internet as well, that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So we spent a lot of time looking at North Korea's infrastructure, but now I wanted to look at this from the other way. I wanted to see, can we actually find any presence of North Korea browsing the internet? If you're not familiar with the way the internet works in North Korea, it started back in 2001. They had a mail relay between Pyongyang, the capital city, and Shenyang, China. Essentially sent batches of email every hour. Cost $1.50 to send an email. Today, there's two different networks in North Korea. There is access to the internet, which is really reserved for party elites. And if you're doing research, you can have essentially timed access to the internet. But most people have access to the intranet, which stays inside the country. This picture here on the right is something that I found on someone's Flickr, which is another great way to get pictures of places that you probably can't go to. This is from an internet cafe. We can see a list of all the websites inside the country here. There were some pictures of the websites on it as well. So we do know that it exists, which is why I thought it was interesting to see a link back to the internal IP addresses. Some of these websites, they do pop up just in various DNS records. Nothing really seems accessible from the internet, but we do know that this is something internally. There are sites available. I've heard numbers anywhere from about 50 to about 300 different sites internally. And we can find some information as well, just published online about marketing material about various apps and services available inside the country as well. So really what started all of this was a couple of years ago, Steam published a map of where everyone was playing. We look really closely, there is one green dot inside of North Korea. So I wanted to see, can we find any information? This is from a Russian oil company. Google had indexed all of their logs. So using a simple Google search, we can find North Korean IP addresses in their logs. Pastebin, another great site to find information. This was from a Minecraft server. You could find all their users on there. Again, we find their the IP address of a North Korean user on this Minecraft server. And then we can really start to get creative here. We can start to look at things like Wikipedia. If you don't have an account, when you're making a change, it'll log your IP address. So we can see they changed this article for where this book was published, from the US to the UK. Various edits made as well under North Korean IP addresses, vandalizing pages as well. We can start to see that there is some activity online where North Korea is browsing out to the internet. This is another good website that I found called iknowwhatyoudownload.com. It really just tracks all the torrents in trackers. So you can find all sorts of information in here about countries, your own IP address. What I did was I wrote a script to query this. And I got a list of all the North Korean IP addresses that were torrenting at that time. But what was really interesting was, not that Modern Family apparently is pretty popular, but we can see a list of all the device drivers that are being torrented as well. So now we can get an idea of what kind of devices are there, what kind of products are inside their computers. Another interesting thing that we can see, and not something that I was necessarily expecting to find as well. And then we talked about their top-level domain .kp. Typically, they're .com, .kp, or .org, .kp. Now that I had a whole list of them, I wanted to see what happens if I bought just the .com version. So I bought 2 of those. They were available. I found one domain in the OS manual, and then I found one kind of weird domain that kept popping up in some threat intel feeds. I bought that one when it became available as well. really all I did. I just put Google Analytics on all of those. I figured it'd probably be pretty weird if you were actually browsing to those domains. So this was my analytics map for the last year. I did get some pretty good traffic to it, nothing explicitly from North Korea, but still a lot more hits than I was expecting with these domains that I had online. So one of the last things, I always like looking at social media as well. I think everyone knows about looking at LinkedIn to see what employees are posting. LinkedIn is apparently becoming very popular in North Korea as well. As far as I know, I haven't gotten any friend requests on there from them. But I've learned if you come up with any kind of crazy hashtag you want to search, there's generally people that are posting things that you probably don't want them posting. Hashtag new job is a great one. You can find all sorts of information there about badges, schedules, employee numbers. Visitor badge is another one. I didn't really think that was going to work, but people are posting pictures of their visitor badges. You can find contact names, numbers. Some people post just a really good look of their visitor badge. So I wanted to see what else can we find about North Korea on social media. I learned that mini kegs are being developed. They have their own brewery inside of North Korea. Mini kegs are being developed right now. This was from a hotel if you do take a tour. I liked this book that someone posted, How to Cope with Potential Disaster. And then if you're staying for a longer time in North Korea, there are people, you can be a student there at some of the colleges if you're from outside the country. There's a couple of embassies inside of North Korea. So people were posting pictures of their student cards, their long-term stays inside the country. And then one of my favorite ones I found, this is the Palace of the Sun. And if you do go on a tour, when they take you here, they're very strict about not taking pictures. Sure enough, if you look on Instagram, you can find some pretty candid pictures here. One of my favorite things is that it's also geotagged on the location. So it makes it easy actually to go back and look at it. So we can really find a lot of things on there, especially things that even something like this where probably don't want to be taking pictures in that instance. I know I certainly wouldn't be, but we can still find pictures online pretty easily. So what else can we learn from this though? We can learn that Windows XP is still pretty popular. There's a lot of pictures of people using XP in a lot of places. It doesn't really seem that the Red Star operating system is used too much outside of official purposes in some of the colleges. It seems like XP is on most of the systems that I've seen pictures of. And again, we want to remember that we can't always trust what we find. North Korea is active on social media, posting things. Most of the links are back to their own websites. But if we look at some of these pictures, sometimes they look a little too perfect all the time. So there's a great website called photoforensics.com. It'll actually go through and analyze all the layers of an image to see, is it something that was potentially photoshopped, and it tries to highlight those. A lot of the pictures do look like this, where nice clear background all the time, nice sunny day. A lot of times it seems that most of these pictures are actually just superimposed on top of these backgrounds. So we always want to remember that even though it is online, we can't always trust what we see there. And then we can really start to get creative with what we're using. Strava is a fitness tracker, and they anonymize all this data. They publish where people are walking with the goal of helping you find fun places to hike and run. I hear things like this, and my first thought was, oh, I wonder what I can find that isn't supposed to be on here. So Strava did actually get in trouble. There were some government bases that were mapped out here that you can find on Strava. I used it for looking at North Korea, and we can actually find a number of routes that people are taking. I assume this is where, if you're there on a tour group, you can get the routes of where people are going. But if you really zoom in, we can see that this is actually down to the building level. So we can see a nice heat map of what's popular. We can see what buildings people are going in. The next thing I want to do is actually overlay this on Google Maps on the satellite view to see if we can get a better idea of what's here. But then up in the northern part of the country, I noticed there were two very faint lines. So when we look at the same location on Google Maps, it kind of looks like a ski resort here. Again, why this is interesting, there is a ski resort in North Korea. It's pretty easy to find pictures. A lot of people might have actually seen it. I think it's pretty popular. But this isn't the location of the ski resort that gets published everywhere. I don't know if this is a second one. I've been trying to find information, but it seems like there is potentially a second one being used, just not the one that always gets talked about. And then to wrap it up here in the last few minutes, a couple of other things that have been put online. This came out a couple of years ago from Checkpoint Research. Silivaccine was an antivirus program developed inside North Korea. It's a great article. It talks all about how it works, some of the things it intentionally misses. But one of the interesting things was, if we go back to GitHub and we start to search things, we can find, this was from the Shadowbrokers leak, from when the CIA tools leaked online. All their code, people mirrored it onto GitHub. And this was from one of their files where they are trying to detect what's on the endpoint. So you see a lot of EDR tools and AV tools in here. But one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting and haven't really seen mentioned is that they're also looking for the presence of the Silivaccine, which was developed in North Korea. So we can see some of the registry keys that they're checking for, certain log files where they're being stored as well. So we can really find a lot of good information on GitHub. One of the other things I've seen on some of the North Korean websites, they have their own fonts that they've developed. So I didn't know too much about these. I was doing a little bit of Googling. I found this message board, found that it was developed inside of North Korea, the font. We started searching those fonts. One of the things that also came across was some of these sandbox sites where you can submit files to for free. They also let you search them. So I found some of the strings that match these North Korean fonts as well. Certainly not enough to do any kind of attribution, but I thought it was interesting to see some files there as well that were actually using these pretty specific characters and font families. And that leads to one of the last things as we start to wrap it up here. Finding actual North Korean software online. This is something I wanted to focus on next. There's a lot of programs out there like Speed Up My PC that are some of these free services, but it turns out they're actually indexing all the software on the back end and publishing it to these sites. So this is where now I've learned you can search some of these. There's different vendors like the Korea Computer Center, Pyongyang Informatics Center, and we can get a good idea of, again, kind of homegrown North Korean software. Not anything malicious, but things being used for day-to-day use. So I actually have a pretty good collection going now, and something I was going to focus on working on next, of talking about really what's there. But we can start to find North Korean software online, and it's another interesting way that we can kind of get an idea of what's running there. So to wrap it up in the last couple of minutes here, one of the things people always ask about is what kind of tools do you use? OSINTFramework.com is a great website. It's a nice spanning tree you can use to kind of click in, and it has all sorts of tools. So I always recommend this. It's much easier than trying to recommend a few tools. I do have my own website, nkinternet.wordpress.com. It's been online for about 4 or 5 years now. Try to keep it a little bit up to date, but that's where I publish anything new that I find. And then one of the last things in the last minute or two here, this was about 4 or 5 years ago. I found this online. We can see it's on the North Korean IP space. And at the top of the browser there, we have things like signature list detection system, CNC server. It seemed pretty interesting. It had a valid certificate. So me being as clever as I was, there was an email address in the certificate. I emailed them. I said, hey, a friend showed me your software. I'm interested in purchasing it. Can I get some more information? Because I want to know more about it. And they said, wrong company. That's not us. Okay, I'm catching on. So I was looking at it a couple weeks later, at 7:30 in the morning on a Sunday, and I got a phone call. It was all zeros on the screen. said, oh, this is weird. So I picked up, the line goes dead. Okay, fine. I go back to looking at this and looking at some of the HTML on it to see if there's any information. My phone rings again a second time. It's all zeros. I get a little nervous. I pick up. I say hello. Again, the phone goes dead. So at this point, I'm thinking, well, it's time to move. It's time to move out of the country, change my name. This isn't good. I'm pacing nervously around my room. I still don't know what this is. I get a call one last time with 3 zeros on the screen. I pick up, I say, hello, who is this? Still no answer, no response. And then I hear a voice, and I'll always remember, they said, Mr. Roy? And I thought, oh, game over. I said, I don't know who wants to know. And he said, this is Steve from Enterprise. Your rental car is ready. Sorry, we've had some problems with our phone this morning. Thanks, Steve. Give me a nice heart attack at 7 in the morning. That's all I had. Thank you again, everyone. Hopefully we can do this in person one day. But thanks for hanging in there and listening. Always truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Looking to see, it looks like we do have at least one question here, if you want to hang out and answer some questions. Have you identified any North Korean associated IPs, maybe via clustering, not hosted within North Korea, maybe from China, etc.?
So, I mean, yes, we know that they are using things outside of North Korea for, we'll say, bad things or malicious things. I try to stay away from that, though, but they are using things for general purposes, though. No, it doesn't seem to be. For kind of day-to-day things, it's really just contained inside of that block of IPs.
Yeah, not having access to some of these applications, you know, I guess there's no way, like maybe a staffer within TikTok could tell us if they're publishing anything on TikTok or if they're jumping on Clubhouse. But from the outside, we can't really tell, right?
Yeah, and if you look on TikTok's map, they actually do have videos there, but it's usually people just faking their location, typically, is what it seems to be.
Nice. Can you repeat the website that checks for certificate fingerprints, and how do you use that info?
Sure, so it's crt.sh, and then you can also use Censys. The idea is you have a fingerprint on that certificate. So if it's being reused anywhere else on another site, in theory, they would find that and have it pop up in the search. Some of the North Korean certificates, they're just wildcard certificates. They reuse them across multiple domains. The only downside to that is all the domains are hosted on the same server. So it's not actually too useful to search for that purpose. But if it was something else, it might work a little better.
Cool. Yeah, everybody else is just saying a great talk. They enjoyed it. See, we've got about 9 minutes before the next talk here. So yeah, if you want to, I think within Sched, you can upload your presentation if you want to share it there, or a link to your presentation if you just rather do a link to it.
Yeah, I can get that put up.
And I don't know if you're in the Discord, but you're welcome to hang out there, and we can promote you to speaker so that people can visually see that you're a speaker. Your tag gets a green text. But yeah, otherwise, thanks. Great talk.
Yeah, I mean, there's Super Ductos. So I joined in last night.
All right, cool. And yeah, somebody was asking if it's being recorded. Yes, probably by this weekend I'll have all these chopped up, you know, because we're recording each track as one giant video file. So I'll have to chop them up and upload them to YouTube one by one. But yeah, I think last year by, you know, like 1 or 2 days after the conference, I had them uploaded. But yeah, I'm just going to say this weekend to give myself a little padding there, a little room. Oh, nice. Somebody says they teach OSINT, and he's going to show this to his class in the fall.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, there you go.
Very cool.
You're part of a lesson plan now. Congrats.
I was gonna say, I would have worn a mask or something too if it was being reused.
Yeah.